A dog's claws ripped at the floorboards. Wood splintered on her teeth. The animal would not stop. Not for shouting. Not for the leash yanking at its neck. It kept tearing at one spot in the corner of the cabin, growling low in its throat. A man dropped to his knees beside it. He pressed his ear to the boards. Something underneath was making a sound. A faint, steady thump. Not wind. Not pipes. Something that should not have been there at all. The veteran had paid only $500 for this cabin. The previous owners had warned him about the ghosts. Cold spots. Voices in the walls. Lights flicking on alone. None of that had bothered Frank Holloway. But this, the thump, the dog, this was something else. What he pulled from under those boards would chain everything he thought he knew. Now stay with me on this one. 3 days before that thump under the floor, Frank Holloway pulled up to a cabin he had never seen except in a photograph. The road in was gravel, the kind that hadn't been graded in 20 years. His truck rocked sideways every few yards. Banner sat in the passenger seat with his nose pressed to the window. The dog had been with him since 2014, when Frank came back from his last deployment and found himself sleeping on the floor of an empty apartment with no wife and no idea what to do next. Banner had been a rescue then, a nervous shepherd mix. He wasn't nervous anymore. The cabin sat at the end of the road on 3 acres of pine and birch. 1 story. Stone chimney. Tin roof half rusted. A porch that sagged on one corner. Frank turned off the engine and just sat there for a minute, looking at it. $500. That's what he had paid. Sealed bid. County tax sale. The realtor's office had called him twice before the auction to make sure he understood what he was buying. Sir, we just want you to know. The property has a history. People back out. Frank had told her he'd seen worse. He had. He really had. He climbed out of the truck. Banner jumped down beside him and walked straight to the porch and stopped. His ears went flat. He didn't growl. He just looked at the door. Frank watched him for a second. Then he pulled the brass key out of his pocket, walked past him, and unlocked the place. The inside smelled like cold wood and dust. A few pieces of furniture left behind by the last owner. A wood stove. A small kitchen with a hand pump for water at the sink. There was a calendar on the wall from 2019. The last person to live here hadn't even been gone long. 3 days. He had been here 3 days. And in those 3 days, here's what had happened. First night. Banner wouldn't lie down. He stood by the kitchen and stared at the corner of the living room. Stared at nothing. Frank called him. Banner came. Then he turned around and went right back and stared at the same spot. That was the first thing. Second thing. The lights. There was electricity to the cabin, barely. 1 bulb hanging from a ceiling cord in the living room. Frank had turned it off before bed. At 3 in the morning, he woke up because it was on. He turned it off again. By morning, it was on. Third thing. A neighbor showed up. Earl Pendergast lived a mile down the road. White hair. Heavy boots. 60-something. He walked up the gravel drive on his own 2 feet on the morning of the second day and introduced himself like a man who already knew Frank's name. "You're the one who bought the Carver place," he said. Frank said he was. "You military? Marines? Retired?" Earl nodded like that answered a question he hadn't asked. He looked at the cabin. Then he looked at Banner, who was watching him from the porch with his head low. "Folks around here," Earl said, "they call it haunted. 3 families bought it after the Carvers left. None of them stayed past a season. What were they afraid of? Earl shrugged. The usual. Cold spots. Lights. Sounds. He paused. Voices in the walls. You believe in that stuff. I believe people leave. That was an odd thing to say. Frank let it sit. Earl didn't elaborate. He just looked at the cabin a while longer and said he would be neighborly and bring some firewood by the next day, and walked back down the gravel road. He didn't bring firewood the next day. He didn't come back at all. Frank kept unpacking. He found a kitchen drawer with a single brass key in it. Not the one he had used to open the front door. A different one. Smaller. Older. He turned it over in his hand. There was no lock in the cabin that it fit. He put it back in the drawer. That night, Banner growled at the corner again. Frank told him to knock it off. Banner didn't knock it off. So that's where Frank was. 3 days in. A dog that wouldn't settle. A neighbor who had said one strange thing and disappeared. A light that turned itself on. And a corner of his living room that Banner could not stop staring at. He had lived through worse, he kept reminding himself. He had lived through much, much worse. But by the third night, even Frank was starting to wonder. The third night was when it changed. Banner started the morning normal enough. Ate his food. Did his rounds outside. Came back in. Then somewhere around noon, he walked over to the corner of the living room and sat down. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just sat, facing the wall. Frank tried calling him. Banner didn't move. Frank walked over, knelt down, put his hand on the dog's back. Banner's whole body was tight, like a spring. He was breathing fast, and his eyes were locked on one specific section of the floor. Frank looked too. The floorboards in that corner were different from the rest. The rest of the cabin had wide pine boards, dark with age, the grain split and worn. The boards in this corner were narrower, newer. The wood was lighter. The nails were galvanized, not the old square-head iron of the rest of the place. Somebody had pulled up this floor and put down new boards. And not that long ago. 20 years, maybe. 30. Hard to tell. Frank stood up. He told himself it was nothing. Old cabins get patched. Maybe a pipe burst. Maybe an animal got in. Maybe somebody dropped a stove and cracked the wood. There were 100 reasons. But Banner kept staring at it. Frank went outside. He walked the perimeter. The property was bigger than he had realized. Behind the cabin there was an old hand pump well, the iron handle rust-frozen. Past the well was a shed. Wooden. About the size of a small garage. The door had a padlock. Frank tried the brass key in it. The brass key didn't fit. He walked past the shed and into the trees. Found a couple of stone markers about 20 feet apart. Old. Hard to read. He couldn't tell if they were graves or property markers. Probably property markers. Probably. Coming back to the cabin, he noticed a piece of wallpaper peeling in the kitchen. Behind it, where the paper had pulled away from the plaster, something white was sticking out. Frank pulled the wallpaper back gently. It was a photograph. A man and a woman. Late 60s or early 70s, judging by the clothes. Standing in front of this cabin. The man was tall, lean, dark-haired. Wearing a button-up shirt and trousers. He was not smiling. He looked like he had something he was about to say and wasn't sure whether to say it. The woman beside him was older. Maybe his mother. She had her hands clasped in front of her. On the back of the photo in pencil, T and Mom. June 1972. Frank put the photograph in his pocket. Banner was still staring at the corner. By dinner, the wind had picked up. By dark, the storm was on top of him. Rain hitting the tin roof like buckshot. Wind in the pines. Frank lit a kerosene lamp because he was pretty sure the power was going to go. He was right. About 9 o'clock, the bulb sputtered out, and the cabin went black except for the lamp. That's when Banner started scratching. He had been staring all day. Now he was clawing. Steady, deliberate, scraping at the floorboards in the corner. The new boards. The newer wood. Frank told him to stop. Banner didn't stop. Frank yelled it. Banner whined and kept scratching. You have to understand. Banner did not do this. In 10 years, Banner had never tried to tear up a floor. Never tried to dig his way out of a room. He would alert at noises. He would growl at strangers. But he would not destroy property. He had been trained better than that, and he was a calm dog by nature. He was not calm now. Frank watched him for 10 minutes. Watched his nails leaving white scratches in the boards. Listening to the storm. And he made a decision. He went to his truck. Got the crowbar. When he came back inside, Banner stepped aside like he had been waiting for it. Frank wedged the crowbar under the edge of one of the new boards and leaned on it. The nails popped one at a time. The board came up in his hand. There was a space underneath. Not a crawl space. Not insulation. Not dirt. Metal. A flat sheet of metal under the floorboard. Painted dark gray. Rusted in places. The kind of metal you would see on a military storage container. Frank crouched down and ran his fingers along the edge. He could feel hinges on one side. He could feel a recessed handle on the other. A hatch. Somebody had built a hatch into the floor of this cabin and then covered it with new boards. He pulled up one more board. Then another. Until the whole hatch was exposed. About 3 feet by 4 feet. Bolts on the corners. The bolts were rusted, but the rust was old, the kind of rust that stops growing. He reached for one of the bolts. And then he stopped. He stopped because Banner had laid down beside him and put his head on his paws. The dog wasn't growling anymore. He wasn't tense. The thing he had been trying to tell Frank for 3 days was now visible to both of them. And Banner was, for the first time since they had arrived, calm. The storm was easing. The rain on the tin roof had softened to a tick. Frank sat back on his heels and looked at the hatch. He thought, I am tired. He thought, this is probably an old root cellar. Or a fallout shelter. The 70s had a lot of fallout shelters. People built them. He thought, whatever this is, it can wait until morning. He stood up. He laid one of the boards back over the hatch loosely. He patted Banner on the head. Banner thumped his tail once. Frank blew out the lamp. He went to bed. He fell asleep almost immediately, like a man who had decided something and didn't have to think about it anymore. And outside, the storm slid east into the trees, and the cabin went quiet, and the dog dozed beside the bed. And for a couple of hours in that little cabin in the woods, nothing at all was wrong. Frank woke up to a door that should have been closed. The front door of the cabin was open. Not wide. Just cracked. Enough for the morning light to come in across the floor. Enough for the cold to be inside the room. Banner was gone. Frank was on his feet before he knew he had decided to stand. His boots were beside the bed. He pulled them on without socks. He grabbed his coat off the chair. He went outside. The yard was empty. The truck was where he had parked it. The gravel road went off into the pines, wet and quiet from last night's storm. There were paw prints in the mud, heading away from the cabin, toward the shed. Frank followed them. He called Banner's name once, then twice. No answer. He kept walking. The paw prints went around the shed and into the trees behind it. Frank pushed through wet branches. 20 yards in, he stopped. Banner was sitting on his haunches under a birch tree. He looked up at Frank like a man who had been waiting. He had something in his mouth. Frank knelt down. "Drop it, buddy." Banner dropped it. It was a piece of fabric, about 4 inches square. Faded, wet from the dew. The color had been olive green a long time ago. There was stitching on one corner. Frank picked it up. He turned it toward the light. 3 letters. Embroidered. Worn but readable. USMC. Frank held it for a long second. It wasn't his. He had not brought anything like that with him. He hadn't unpacked anything like that. There was no reason for a piece of Marine Corps uniform to be in the dirt behind a shed at a cabin he had bought 3 days ago. Unless somebody had buried it here. Unless somebody had buried something here. His chest got that quiet, narrow feeling it got before a thing happened. He had felt that feeling many times in his life. Twice in Fallujah. Once in Helmand. Once in a courtroom. He knew it. He didn't waste it. He stood up. He looked at Banner. Banner looked back. "Show me," Frank said. Banner walked further into the trees. Frank followed. They didn't go far. Maybe 30 more feet. Banner stopped at a low mound of dirt, freshly disturbed by his own paws. There was a small hole. Not deep. Banner had been digging. The piece of fabric had been on top. Frank looked into the hole. There was nothing more in it. Not yet. But the dirt was loose. And the cloth was old. And somewhere under this property, under the floor of his cabin, there was a metal hatch with a name still unspoken. He went back inside. He went to the corner of the living room. He pulled the loose board off the hatch. He looked at the bolts. He went to the truck. He came back with a socket wrench and penetrating oil. It took him 40 minutes to get the first bolt to move. He sprayed. He waited. He turned. He waited. He turned again. The metal cried. Banner sat in the corner and watched him work. The other 3 bolts came faster. By the time the last one was out, Frank's hands were filthy and his shoulder was burning. He hooked his fingers in the recessed handle. He pulled. The hatch swung up on stiff hinges. It hit the floor behind it with a low thud. Cold air came out of the hole. Not just cool. Cold. Clean. The way a fridge smells when you first open it. Below the hatch was a steel ladder bolted to the wall of a concrete shaft. Frank lay flat on the floor and shone his flashlight down. The shaft went down about 8 feet. At the bottom, it opened into a chamber. Concrete walls. Concrete floor. The chamber was bigger than the shaft suggested. He could see a corner of it. He could see boxes. Foot lockers. Stacked against the wall. Frank sat back. He looked at Banner. If you've ever stayed with a story this long, this is the part where I have to ask you something. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. There's more coming, and you're going to want to see how this ends. Now stay with me. Frank climbed down. He counted 6 footlockers. Old. Military issue olive drab. Stenciled with names and ranks. He pointed his flashlight at the closest one. The stencil read, CPLT. VOSS USMC. Theodore Voss. Frank said the name out loud just to hear it. Banner whined from the top of the shaft. Frank unlatched the footlocker. It opened. Inside were papers. Many. Bundles of them tied with rubber bands that had long since dried and split. Letters in handwritten ink, folded carefully. Carbon copies of typed reports, the carbon flaking off in his fingers. Photographs in a tin box. Newspaper clippings, brittle and yellow, in a separate stack. Frank picked up the top clipping. The headline was small. From a regional paper. The date was October 1972. Marine reported missing after discharge. He picked up the next. Local veterans' whereabouts unknown. Family appeals for help. He picked up a photograph from the tin box. It was the same photograph he had pulled out from behind the kitchen wallpaper. Tea and Mom. June 1972. He had it folded in his shirt pocket right now. Theodore Voss. Corporal. United States Marine Corps. Walked off the face of the earth in October of 1972 and was never seen again. Except his footlocker was here. In a sealed chamber. Under the floor of the cabin he had bought. With a Marine Corps uniform patch buried in his yard. And then Banner barked. Not at the hatch. Banner barked at the door. Banner barked at the road. Frank climbed up the ladder fast. He came up out of the floor and through the living room and to the front window. He looked out. An old pickup truck was coming up the gravel road. White roof. Rusted blue door. Coming slow. Earl Pendergast was in the driver's seat. Earl, who had said he believed in people leaving. Earl, who had not come back for 3 days. Earl was coming back now. Frank had about 90 seconds. He shut the footlocker. He climbed up the ladder. He swung the hatch closed and pressed the loose floorboard back over it. He grabbed the photograph and the top newspaper clipping and the piece of USMC fabric off the table and shoved them into a drawer in the kitchen. He washed his hands at the pump sink. He pulled his coat off the chair like he had just come in from outside. Banner was at the door, low growl in his chest. "Easy," Frank said. "Be easy. Sit." Banner sat. The pickup pulled up to the cabin and stopped. Earl got out slow. He had a paper bag in one hand. He raised it in greeting. "Brought you some firewood the other day and forgot to drop it," Earl said. "Brought you some coffee instead." Frank opened the door. "Come on in." Earl came in. He looked around the room the way a man looks for something he knows is there. His eyes went to the corner. Just a flick. Just a glance. He saw the disturbed boards. He didn't say anything about them. Frank poured the coffee Earl had brought into 2 cups. Banner stood behind Frank's leg with his eyes on Earl's hands. "You sleep well?" Earl asked. "Well enough. Storm last night was something." "It was." Earl took a sip of his coffee. He looked at Frank over the rim of the cup. "You been digging?" he said. Frank didn't answer. "Saw your boots," Earl said. "Mud on them up to the ankle. And your hands, son. You got rust under your nails." Frank set his cup down on the table. The conversation had shifted. He could feel it. He had felt it before, in rooms in other countries, with men who were deciding how much to admit and how much to lie. "Earl," Frank said. "Who was Theodore Voss?" Earl's face did something then. Not surprise. Recognition. He set his cup down too. He looked at the corner of the living room. Then he looked at his hands. "You opened it," he said. "I opened the floor. I haven't opened the boxes yet." Earl knew that was a lie. Earl also knew Frank knew Earl knew. They both let it sit. Then Earl started talking. He said Theodore Voss had come back from Vietnam in 1971. He had been a corporal. He had served in a reconnaissance unit. He had seen things. Earl said that part carefully. He had seen things, and when he came home, he had started writing them down. Officers' names, dates, coordinates, orders that hadn't been on paper, villages that were not on any incident report, bodies that had been counted as combatants but were not. Voss had bought this cabin in 1972 for $600. He had brought his records with him. He had told a few people what he had. He had told his mother. He had told a reporter in Detroit. He had told Earl. Earl had been 23 years old. Earl had served too. Earl had served with some of the men Voss was writing about. "I told the wrong man," Earl said. "I told a friend of mine. My friend told a colonel. The colonel knew people. They came up here in October. 2 of them. Plus me. I went along because I thought we were going to talk to him." Earl looked at Banner. "We did not talk to him," he said. "Frank didn't move. They told me to stand outside. I stood outside. When it was over, the colonel showed me where Voss had built the chamber under the cabin. Voss had built it himself. He had wanted a safe place for his records. The colonel said it was a kindness to put him in there with them." Earl's voice was very quiet. "We sealed it. We put new boards over it. We told his mother he had walked away. We told the paper he had walked away. We told everybody. And his mother died believing it. And the cabin started its bad reputation that same month. We helped it along. We told stories about lights and voices. We made sure the cabin was always cheap. Always cheap enough that the people who bought it were the ones who would give up fastest." He looked at Frank. "And we waited for it to fall in on itself," he said. "For the wood to rot and the roof to cave and the chamber to be buried. 50 years, son. 50 years it almost worked." Frank said almost. Earl said, "Then you bought it. And you brought a dog." Frank said, "The other 2 men. The colonel and your friend. Where are they?" Earl said, "Dead. Years ago. I'm the last one." Frank said, "The name's in Voss's records. Are any of those men still alive?" Earl smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of an old man who has been carrying something for 50 years. "Some of them are in office, Frank. Some of them are very much alive." Frank stood up. "I'm taking those records to the federal building in Marquette. I'm going to give them to an agent. And then I'm going to call Voss's family if there's anyone left." Earl said, "His sister is still alive." Frank said, "Good." That was when Earl pulled the pistol. It came out of his coat pocket smooth and slow and pointed at Frank's chest. He had not raised his voice. He had not changed his expression. He just took the gun out and aimed it. "Sit down, son," Earl said. "We're going to seal it back up. You and me. Tonight." Banner moved. Banner moved before Frank could speak. He came across the floor in 2 strides and locked his teeth around Earl's wrist. The pistol went sideways. It clattered onto the floorboards and slid across the room toward the corner where Banner had been sitting for 3 days. Earl screamed. Banner did not let go. Frank crossed the room and got the pistol. He came back. He told Banner to release. Banner released. Earl was on the floor. Frank pointed the pistol at the wood between Earl's boots, not at Earl, but close enough. He said, "Earl, stay down." Earl stayed down. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was Earl's breathing and the rain starting up again outside. Then Earl said, "You don't understand what you're stepping into. The names in those papers, Frank. Those men have money. Those men have lawyers. Those men have other men. They will come for you." Frank said, "Let them." Frank drove to Marquette that afternoon. He drove with Earl Pendergast tied at the wrists in the passenger seat. He drove with Banner in the back, with the footlockers stacked next to him, the lids tight, the papers inside as Voss had left them in 1972. He drove the gravel road first, then the county road, then the highway, 2 hours of pine forest sliding past the windows. He didn't talk much. Earl didn't either. They had said everything they needed to say in the cabin. In Marquette, Frank parked in front of the federal building. He went in alone. He asked for the agent on duty for the field office, and the woman at the desk asked him what it concerned, and he said it concerned a missing Marine. She asked him how long he had been missing. He said 54 years. 3 hours later, agents had Earl in a room. 3 hours after that, agents had the footlockers in a secured evidence room with gloved hands going through them one bundle at a time. Frank gave a statement. He gave another statement. He gave the address of the cabin and the location of the hatch. He gave the agent in charge the brass key from the kitchen drawer because he had finally figured out what it was for. It was the key to Voss's footlocker. The original key. Voss had left it where he hoped someone would find it. Frank drove home in the dark. The story went into a local paper first. Then the Detroit Free Press. Then the wires picked it up. The records held names. The names held photos. The photos held places and dates and orders and casualty counts that had never made it into any official record. 2 retired officers were indicted within a year. One sitting senator quietly announced he would not seek another term. A military criminal investigation that had been closed in 1973 was reopened. Earl Pendergast pled guilty to accessory after the fact and was sentenced to 7 years. He was 76 when he was sentenced. He served almost all of it. In April, Voss's sister came to the cabin. Her name was Margaret. She was 78. She drove herself up from Lansing in a sedan that wasn't built for the gravel road, and when she got out, she was small and steady, and her eyes were exactly the same eyes as the man in the photograph. Frank brought her inside. He showed her the corner of the room where Banner had scratched. He showed her the chamber, though he didn't ask her to go down. He gave her the photographs. He gave her the letters Voss had written to her in 1972 that had never been mailed. There were 11 of them. He had kept them safe after the agents had copied them. She sat on the porch and read them. She read all 11. She did not cry until the last one. When she was done, she sat for a long time with the letters on her lap. Then she said he was the kind of brother who couldn't lie. That's why they killed him. Frank said, I know. She said, thank you for finding him. Frank said it was the dog. She looked at Banner. Banner came over and put his head on her knee. Then thank you, she said, for bringing the dog. That summer, with help from a couple of veterans who came up from downstate because they had read about the case, Frank rebuilt the corner of the cabin. He took the hatch out. He filled the chamber with clean dirt. He laid new boards. He sanded the floor. He did not paint over what had happened, but he closed it. In the trees behind the cabin, where Banner had found the patch of cloth, Frank dug a real grave. He put up a real marker. Granite. Engraved. It said, Corporal Theodore United States Marine Corps, 1948 to 1972. He told the truth. Margaret came back for the dedication. So did 2 of the agents. So did a Marine Corps honor guard from Selfridge, which Frank had not asked for but which had been arranged. They folded a flag and gave it to Margaret. She held it the way you hold a small child. After everyone left, Frank stood at the marker for a while. Banner sat beside him. The cabin was quiet now. The lights did not turn on by themselves anymore. The corner of the living room was just a corner. There were no voices in the walls. There were no cold spots. Whatever had been in that cabin had not been ghosts. It had been a man waiting to be heard, and a few old neighbors keeping a secret, and a story that the locals told to keep new people from looking too close. The story was over. Sometimes at night, Banner still walked over to that corner of the living room. He would put his nose down to the floorboards. He would breathe in slow. Frank, sitting in his chair by the wood stove, would watch him do it. "He's not down there anymore, buddy," Frank would say. "He's home." Banner would thump his tail once. He would walk back over and lie down at Frank's feet. And outside, the wind in the pines would do what the wind in the pines does, which is nothing in particular. And the cabin Frank Holloway had bought for $500 without flinching at its reputation would sit there in the dark, 3 acres of pine and birch around it, quiet at last, with a man and a dog inside it who had found the one thing nobody had dared to open. And that was the secret. It was not a haunting. It was a name.